My name is Elena Mendoza. I saved 347 lives in the 5 years I worked as a nurse at Lakeside Regional Hospital, and now I'm facing 25 years in federal prison. This is the story of how desperation turned me into a criminal, and how that crime made me the healer I was always meant to be. They called me a hero nurse. I was on the news. Patients thanked me, but I never had a medical license, not even a high school diploma. My hands have delivered babies, stopped bleeding, administered life-saving medications, and held those passing from this world to the next. These same hands once picked strawberries in California fields. They scrubbed toilets in Texas motels. They forged documents in a Chicago basement. Before I tell you how I ended up in handcuffs on the evening news, let me take you back to where it began. Not to nursing school. I never set foot in one, but to a different kind of education. The kind you get when your mother dies of a treatable infection because the clinic in your village has no antibiotics. When your brother's broken arm heals crooked because setting it properly costs more than your family earns in 3 months. When your neighbor's child stops breathing in the night, and the nearest doctor is 2 hours away, on roads washed out by rain. I was 12 when I became the unofficial medic of San Pedro Itzican, armed with a dog-eared medical manual from the 1970s, whatever supplies the missionary groups left behind, and a desperate need to help. By 17, I could stitch wounds, set bones, and identify dozens of illnesses by their symptoms. I delivered my first baby at 18, twins actually, when Senora Vega went into labor 2 months early. I wasn't a nurse. I was just the only one there. When I crossed the border at 22, I carried two things: my grandmother's silver cross and that tattered medical manual, its pages soft as cloth from years of desperate study. I never planned to become an imposter, but life has a way of steering you down unexpected roads. And in Millridge, Wisconsin, with its shuttered factories and decimated hospital staff, I found myself facing a familiar scene: people in need, no one to help them, and two hands that knew more than my papers said they should. So I made new papers, and Elena Mendoza became Elena Martinez, RN. The question America is now debating: was that the act of a criminal or a healer? The crossingee left Mexico on a Tuesday night in March 2016, not the dramatic dash across the desert you see in movies. I simply overstayed a temporary agricultural worker visa, picked strawberries in California until the season ended, then never went home. The plan was simple: work for a few years, send money back to my family, eventually return to open a proper clinic in San Pedro. My village needed health care, and health care required money. For 3 years, I followed the invisible path of the undocumented: housekeeping jobs paid in cash, shared apartments with other migrants, English classes at community centers. Always careful, always looking over my shoulder, always aware that everything could end with a single traffic stop. I moved east gradually, following work opportunities: the housekeeping job at a Chicago hotel, the elder care position in Indianapolis, each step taking me further from the border, deeper into America. By 2019, I had settled in Millridge, Wisconsin, a town of 15,000 that had seen better days. The furniture factory that once employed half the town had closed. The paper mill operated at reduced capacity. The downtown had more empty storefronts than businesses. I found work caring for Mrs. Abernathy, an 87-year-old widow whose children lived out of state. The job was straightforward: cook her meals, help her bathe, administer her many medications, and provide companionship. What I didn't expect was that Mrs. Abernathy had been a nurse for 45 years before retirement, or that she would recognize something in me that I barely acknowledged myself. "You have healer's hands," she told me one evening as I wrapped her swollen ankles with practiced precision. Where did you learn that technique? I gave my usual vague answer about helping care for family back home, but Mrs. Abernathy wasn't easily fooled. Over the months that followed, she began treating our time together as an informal apprenticeship. She corrected my technique for administering insulin. She explained the interaction between her various heart medications. She shared stories from her decades in emergency rooms and delivery wards. And I absorbed everything, my mind connecting her professional knowledge with the practical skills I'd developed in my village. When Mrs. Abernathy had a stroke in early 2020, I was the one who recognized the symptoms immediately, who called the ambulance, who rode with her to Lakeside Regional, reciting her medical history to the paramedics with perfect precision. In the chaotic emergency room, understaffed even before the pandemic that was just beginning to make headlines, a harried doctor mistook me for a nurse accompanying a patient. Thank God, she muttered, handing me a clipboard. We're desperate for staff. Are you looking for shifts? We need everyone we can get. I opened my mouth to correct her, to explain that I wasn't a nurse, just a home health aide. But before I could speak, Mrs. Abernathy, still conscious despite her stroke, squeezed my hand. She's excellent, she managed to say through partially paralyzed lips. Trained in Mexico, it was a lie born of affection, a well-intentioned deception. It was also the moment that changed everything. Come by HR tomorrow, the doctor said, already moving on to the next emergency. We're expediting applications. Bring your credentials. That night, as Mrs. Abernathy lay in a hospital bed, I sat in her empty house and faced the most significant moral crossroads of my life. I could walk away, continue as I had been, working under the table jobs, sending remittances home, living in the shadows, or I could become someone else, someone with papers, someone who could help in a more meaningful way. 3 days later, Elena Martinez, registered nurse, graduate of Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, legal resident through marriage to a U.S. citizen, now divorced, submitted her application to Lakeside Regional Hospital. The credentials were impeccable, created by a man in Chicago who specialized in such documents for undocumented workers. They cost me nearly every dollar I had saved over 3 years. What I didn't know then, the pandemic about to sweep through America would render normal verification processes nearly obsolete. Hospitals desperate for staff would accept credentials at face value. Background checks would be expedited or overlooked entirely, and Millridge, Wisconsin, already suffering from a healthcare worker shortage before COVID-19, would become the perfect place for a fake nurse to become an essential worker. My first day at Lakeside Regional should have exposed me immediately. I expected to be discovered within hours, my lack of formal training obvious to any real medical professional. What I found instead was chaos. The hospital, designed to serve the rural communities of northern Wisconsin, had been operating at 60% staffing capacity for years. Now, with the pandemic's first wave hitting and healthcare workers falling ill or quitting due to burnout, that number had dropped to below 40%. I was assigned to the medical surgical floor, the catch-all unit for patients who needed hospitalization but not intensive care. My orientation consisted of a 30-minute tour by an exhausted charge nurse named Diane, who seemed relieved just to have another body in scrubs. Charting system's pretty intuitive, she said, logging me into a computer. Med protocols are all in there. Just ask if you get stuck. Though honestly, we're so short-staffed, you might be on your own most shifts. That first day was a blur of patients, medications, and procedures. I relied heavily on the hospital's electronic medical record system, which, thankfully, included standard protocols for most common conditions. When in doubt, I observed others or asked questions framed as, Just double checking how you do that here. What saved me, what nobody expected, was how much I actually knew. Not from nursing school, but from years of being the de facto healthcare provider for my village. From Mrs. Abernathy's impromptu lessons. From that dog-eared medical manual I'd practically memorized. I knew how to start IVs because I'd done it countless times with improvised equipment. I could recognize the subtle signs of deterioration in a patient because I'd watched for them without monitoring machines. I understood the progression of diseases because I'd seen them unfold without intervention. What I lacked in formal education, I made up for in practical experience and a desperate determination not to harm anyone. By the end of my first week, I had developed a system. Before each shift, I researched my patients' conditions and medications. During quiet moments, I studied medical references on my phone. I volunteered for tasks I knew I could handle and found reasons to swap assignments for those I couldn't. And I watched. Constantly, carefully watched the real nurses, absorbing their techniques, their terminology, their instincts. The strangest part? I was good at it, not just passable, genuinely good. My patients recovered quickly under my care. Doctors commented on my thorough assessments. Fellow nurses appreciated my willingness to take on the most demanding patients or the least desirable tasks. "Where did you train again?" asked Dr. Patel one night after I spotted a subtle medication interaction that could have harmed a patient. "Mexico," I said, the lie now practiced and smooth. "A small university hospital, very hands-on approach." He nodded appreciatively. "It shows. We need more nurses with your practical skills. Too many come out of school these days, knowing the theory but freezing in real situations." As weeks turned to months, my anxiety about being discovered gradually transformed into a different fear, that I might make a mistake that would harm someone, not because I was an imposter, but because medicine itself is a field where even the most qualified professionals can err. I compensated by being meticulously careful, triple checking medications, consulting references for even minor procedures, asking questions when uncertain, framing them as regional differences in practice rather than gaps in knowledge. I worked primarily with elderly patients whose complex conditions required careful monitoring, but whose treatments often follow predictable patterns. I became known for my patience, my attention to detail, and my willingness to sit with the dying when their families couldn't be present due to COVID restrictions. What no one knew was that I'd sat with the dying in my village too, had held their hands as they passed, not in sterile hospital rooms, but in homes with dirt floors and thatched roofs. Death had been my teacher long before Lakeside Regional. By the time the pandemic's first wave began to recede, I had been working at the hospital for 6 months. My false identity had become real in every practical sense. Elena Martinez, RN, existed in payroll systems, in personnel files, in the hospital's hierarchy, and somewhere along the way, the lie I'd been living began to feel less like a deception and more like a calling finally fulfilled. I wasn't pretending to be a nurse anymore. In all the ways that mattered to my patients, I had become one. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, July 14th, 2021. I remember checking the time as I fumbled for my phone, having just fallen asleep after a grueling 12-hour shift. "Martinez? It's Diane. We need you at the hospital now. Bus crash on Highway 51. Multiple casualties. All hands on deck." I was in my car 3 minutes later, adrenaline burning away exhaustion. The scene at Lakeside Regional was controlled chaos. Ambulances lined the emergency department bay. Staff ran between rooms. The normally quiet hospital hummed with urgent activity. A tour bus carrying seniors from a church group had crashed down an embankment. 37 injured, varying degrees of severity. The closest trauma center was 90 minutes away, and the weather was too poor for helicopter evacuations. We were it. Our small, understaffed rural hospital would have to handle a mass casualty event. I was directed to Trauma Room 3, where a woman in her 70s lay unconscious, blood seeping through bandages wrapped around her head. Dr. Levine, the overnight ED physician, looked up as I entered. Martinez, thank God. I need you here. Patient's got a subdural hematoma and possible tension pneumothorax. We need to place a chest tube before transporting her. Respiratories backed up with 2 other cases. In nursing school, the real nursing school I never attended, this would be a specialized skill requiring supervision and certification. But in that moment, there was no time for such considerations. I've done this before, I said, which wasn't technically a lie. I had assisted with chest tube placement in a car accident victim back home, though under very different circumstances, with far more primitive tools. Dr. Levine nodded, already preparing the site. Good, let's move. The next hours passed in a blur of procedures, assessments, and interventions. I moved between patients as needed, falling into a rhythm with the rest of the staff. At some point, a news crew arrived, filming the hospital's response to the crisis for the local station. By morning, when reinforcements arrived from neighboring facilities, we had stabilized all 37 victims. No deaths, no critical failures. A miracle given our resources. I was checking on my original patient, now conscious and stable following emergency surgery, when Dr. Patel found me. Martinez, there's a news crew doing a piece on the hospital's response last night. They want to interview some of the staff. You up for it? I froze. Being on camera was the last thing I wanted. My face on local news, my name in public records. These were risks I couldn't afford to take. I don't think that's a good idea, I started to say. But before I could finish, the woman in the bed reached for my hand. This nurse, she said, her voice weak but determined. She saved my life. The doctor told me this morning, said if she hadn't placed that tube so quickly. She trailed off, tears forming in her eyes. Dr. Patel smiled. See, you're a hero, Martinez. Just a quick statement about the team effort. Good PR for the hospital, and God knows we need the community support for funding. How could I refuse without seeming suspicious, without disappointing this patient who saw me as her savior? The interview lasted less than 2 minutes. I kept my answers vague and focused on the collective effort, deflecting personal praise. I thought, hoped, that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The story ran that evening. Angels in Scrubs, how Lakeside Regional's dedicated staff saved 37 lives. A human interest piece amid the ongoing pandemic coverage, featuring brief clips of several staff members, including me. By the next day, the segment had been picked up by regional news. By the weekend, a national network included portions in a feature about rural healthcare workers during the pandemic. Suddenly, Elena Martinez was no longer an invisible presence in an understaffed hospital. She was a face, a name, a story. A week after the bus crash, a reporter from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel arrived in Millridge. Veronica Castillo was working on an in-depth piece about the healthcare worker shortage in rural communities and its impact during the pandemic. The bus crash response had caught her attention as a positive example of what these struggling hospitals could accomplish despite limited resources. She requested interviews with several staff members, including me. I tried to decline, cited my busy schedule, my discomfort with publicity. But hospital administration, eager for the positive coverage, insisted. Just share your journey, your passion for nursing, they encouraged. Humanize the profession. Maybe it will help our recruitment efforts. The interview was scheduled for July 25th, 2021. I had exactly 3 days to decide: disappear entirely or risk everything by sitting down with a journalist whose job was to verify facts and dig for the truth. In the end, a third option presented itself, one I hadn't considered. The night before the interview, an elderly man was admitted with COVID-19 complications. As I checked his vitals, he squinted at me through his oxygen mask. "I know you," he said, voice muffled. "Saw you on the news, but I knew you before that." My heart stuttered. "I don't think so, sir. I'd remember." He shook his head weakly. "Not as a nurse, years ago. You worked at the Sunshine Motel in Rockford, Illinois. Housekeeping. 2018, I think. I was the maintenance man." The room seemed to tilt. He was right. I had worked there for 3 months before moving to Wisconsin. "You're mistaken," I said automatically, adjusting his IV. "I've been a nurse for many years." His eyes, roomy but sharp, held mine. "No," he said quietly, "you haven't." In that moment, looking into his knowing gaze, I made my decision. I would meet with Veronica Castillo, and I would tell her the truth, not all of it, not at first, but enough to take control of a narrative that was about to unravel regardless of my choices. Because sometimes the only way out is through. Veronica Castillo met me at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. My request, away from the hospital and its curious ears. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with alert eyes that missed nothing. "I appreciate you making time for this," she said as we settled at a corner table. "I know how busy hospital staff are, especially now." I nodded, hands wrapped around my mug to hide their trembling. "I should tell you up front that I'm not comfortable being the focus of your story. There are others at Lakeside who deserve recognition more than I do." She smiled. "Modesty is common among healthcare workers, but your colleagues specifically mentioned you as someone who exemplifies the best of rural nursing. Your background is particularly interesting. Training in Mexico, then bringing those skills to underserved communities here. The opening I needed." "About my background," I said carefully. "It's complicated." Something in my tone caught her attention. The journalist's instinct for a story beneath the story. "Complicated how?" she asked. Recorder still off, notebook closed. I took a deep breath. "What I'm about to tell you, I need to know if it can be off the record, at least initially." Her expression shifted, professional interest tempered with caution. "That depends on what it is. If you're telling me about illegal activity or something that puts patients at risk, I can't promise confidentiality." "It's about my credentials," I said after a long pause, "and my identity." What followed was a careful dance. I revealed parts of my story, my village background, my unofficial medical experience, my immigration status, while withholding others. I didn't admit outright to using forged documents or practicing without a license. Instead, I spoke of alternative paths to medical knowledge and barriers in credential recognition between countries. Veronica listened intently, asking occasional clarifying questions, but allowing me to control the narrative. When I finished, she sat back, studying me with an unreadable expression. "So, you're telling me you have medical knowledge and experience that doesn't align with your official credentials?" "Yes, but you've been working at Lakeside for over a year with no incidents, no patient complaints. In fact, with commendations?" "Yes." She tapped her pen against her closed notebook. "Why tell me this now? You must realize this could end your career, possibly result in criminal charges." I thought of the maintenance man who recognized me, of the increasing media attention, of the fragile house of cards I'd been living in. "Because the truth has a way of emerging eventually," I said, "and I'd rather it come from me than be discovered by someone else." She nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty, but I need time to think about this. about the ethical implications for me as a journalist and for you as a caregiver. We parted with no commitments on either side. I had taken an enormous risk, but one that felt necessary, a preemptive strike against the inevitable. 3 days later, Veronica called. I want to tell your full story, she said. The real one. Not as an expose, but as an examination of our broken healthcare system. I believe there's a greater public interest in understanding how someone with your background ended up being essential to a rural hospital during a crisis. And the legal implications for me? I can't protect you from those, she said honestly. But I can provide context, can show the circumstances that led to your choices and the good that's come from them. It wasn't the guarantee I wanted, but it was perhaps the best I could hope for. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with Veronica several times. Gradually, I shared more details: the forged documents, the specific procedures I'd performed, the measures I'd taken to ensure patient safety despite my lack of formal credentials. She interviewed others as well: patients whose lives I'd helped save, colleagues who had worked alongside me, experts in rural healthcare policy. She researched similar cases nationally and internationally, placing my story within a broader context of healthcare access disparities. The article, titled The Undocumented Healer, was published on August 30th, 2021. It began: Elena Mendoza never went to nursing school. She has no formal medical training, no license, and until recently, no legal status in the United States. Yet for the past 16 months, she has provided critical care to hundreds of patients at an understaffed rural Wisconsin hospital, saving lives, easing suffering, and becoming an essential worker in a healthcare system stretched beyond its breaking point. This is not simply a story about fraud. It is a story about desperation, both hers and that of a rural community with too few healthcare providers. It is a story that raises uncomfortable questions about who we allow to heal and why, about the arbitrary barriers we place between skill and certification, and about a system so broken that it inadvertently made room for an unlikely caregiver. The article was nuanced, thoughtful, and devastatingly thorough. It presented me neither as a villain nor an unambiguous hero, but as a complex figure shaped by circumstance and choice. It also, as expected, upended my life completely. I was suspended from Lakeside Regional the day the article was published. The police arrived at my apartment the following morning with a warrant for my arrest. Charges including identity theft, fraud, practicing medicine without a license, and immigration violations. As I was led to the police car in handcuffs, neighbors watched from their porches. Some looked shocked or disgusted. Others called out words of support. You saved my mother last year, one woman shouted. I don't care what they say. You're a nurse to me. What I didn't expect was how quickly the story would spread, or how divisive it would become. Within days, the undocumented healer was trending on social media. National news programs debated the ethical implications. Politicians on both sides seized on my case to argue for their respective immigration and healthcare policies. In Millridge, the community split. Some demanded the maximum sentence, feeling personally betrayed by someone they had trusted with their health. Others rallied to my defense, organizing protests outside the courthouse and raising money for my legal fees. The hospital faced its own crisis, forced to review every case I had handled, every patient I had treated. They found what I already knew: not a single instance of negligence or harm. In fact, my patient outcomes had consistently ranked among the highest on staff. My preliminary hearing drew crowds on both sides. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor painted me as a calculated fraudster who had endangered lives for personal gain. My public defender emphasized my positive impact and the dire circumstances that had led to my choices. As I sat at the defendant's table, I caught sight of familiar faces in the gallery. Dr. Patel, Diane from the night shift, even Mrs. Abernathy, now recovered from her stroke, supported by a walker, and in the back row, taking careful notes, Veronica Castillo, documenting the next chapter of a story she had helped bring to light. The judge set bail at $250,000, an impossible sum for someone in my position. I was returned to the county jail to await trial, facing up to 25 years if convicted on all counts. That night, alone in my cell, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not for the freedom I had lost or the punishment I faced, but for the patients who needed care that an understaffed hospital could no longer provide. I had known the risks, had accepted them as the price of doing what I believed was right. What I hadn't anticipated was how my individual story would ignite a national conversation about who deserves to heal and be healed in America. A nation divided. The 3 months I spent in county jail awaiting trial were a study in contrasts. Inside, monotony, isolation, the slow grinding down of the human spirit that is the true punishment of incarceration. Outside, a growing movement, media frenzy, and deeply divided public opinion about what my case represented. Veronica kept me informed through approved visits, bringing news clippings and updates. My story had struck a chord far beyond what either of us had anticipated. Conservative media portrayed me as the embodiment of immigration fears, an illegal alien who had infiltrated a trusted profession, compromised patient safety, and stolen a job from a qualified American. Tucker Carlson devoted an entire segment to my case, calling it the inevitable result of open borders and lowered standards. Progressive outlets framed me as a victim of systemic barriers, a skilled healthcare worker forced into deception by an immigration system that offered no path to legitimacy, and a medical establishment that prioritized credentials over competence. Last Week Tonight with John Oliver used my story to highlight the rural healthcare crisis and the arbitrary nature of many licensing requirements. Medical organizations were similarly divided. The American Nurses Association condemned my actions as a dangerous undermining of professional standards essential for patient safety. But an open letter signed by over 200 healthcare providers argued that my case revealed the artificial scarcity created by overly rigid credentialing processes that fail to recognize diverse paths to medical knowledge. In Millridge, the division was more personal. Former patients came forward with stories, some defending my care as exceptional, others retrospectively questioning every interaction. Hospital administrators, facing potential lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny, distanced themselves completely, claiming they had been victims of sophisticated fraud. Only my colleagues maintained a complicated solidarity. They couldn't publicly support my deception, but many acknowledged privately what Diane expressed in a letter smuggled to me through my lawyer. We all knew something wasn't quite right with your paperwork, but you were so good with patients, so willing to take the hardest cases, work the worst shifts. In a system where we were drowning, you were someone who helped us keep our heads above water. As my case moved toward trial, it became increasingly clear that I was being positioned as a symbolic figure in larger cultural and political battles. My actual story, the village in Mexico, the desperate attempts to help, the genuine care I had provided, was being flattened into talking points. The prosecution offered a plea deal, guilty on all counts with a recommended sentence of 8 years. My public defender urged me to take it, citing the overwhelming evidence against me and the current political climate around immigration. But something unexpected happened the week before I needed to respond to the offer. A new patient was admitted to Lakeside Regional, Teresa Guzman, a 62-year-old woman with complications from diabetes. Under normal circumstances, her condition would have been manageable. But the hospital, still struggling with staffing shortages, failed to notice the signs of developing sepsis until it was nearly too late. By the time she was transferred to the ICU in Madison, Teresa was in critical condition. She died 3 days later. Her daughter, Maria Guzman, went public with her grief and rage. My mother would be alive if Elena Mendoza had been her nurse, she told reporters outside the hospital. I've seen the records. I've talked to staff. They missed what Elena never would have missed because she had to be twice as careful, twice as attentive just to survive. Maria's testimony catalyzed something in the community. Other family members of patients came forward with similar stories of care delayed or denied in the months since my arrest, of a hospital functioning even more precariously without the staff they had come to rely on, regardless of my credentials. A group of former patients organized a petition arguing that the public interest would be better served by allowing me to work under supervision than by imprisonment. It gathered over 10,000 signatures, remarkable for a town of 15,000. Local clergy joined the movement, framing my case in terms of compassion and the greater good. We must ask ourselves, said Pastor Miller of the First Methodist Church, what Christ would value more, adherence to credentialing laws or the healing of the sick and suffering? Even the hospital administration, initially among my harshest critics, began to soften their stance as the staffing crisis worsened and patient outcomes declined. The CEO released a carefully worded statement acknowledging my positive contribution to patient care, while maintaining that proper credentials remain essential to healthcare integrity. The district attorney's office, sensing the shifting public sentiment, revised their plea offer, guilty to lesser charges, with a sentence of 3 years. My lawyer called it the best outcome we could hope for under the circumstances. But the night before I was to accept the deal, I received an unexpected visitor. Judge Helen Martinez, no relation to my alias, had requested a private meeting, an unusual move that my lawyer cautioned against, but ultimately couldn't prevent. In the small interview room of the county jail, the judge, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for by-the-book rulings, studied me with piercing eyes. Ms. Mendoza, she said after a long silence, I've reviewed your case extensively. The evidence against you is overwhelming. There is no legal scenario in which you are not guilty of the crimes charged. I nodded, having long accepted this reality. However, she continued, the law is not always equipped to address complex human situations. Sometimes justice and legality diverge. She leaned forward slightly. My mother was a curandera in a small town in northern Mexico. No formal training, no license, just knowledge passed down through generations and a deep commitment to healing. When we came to the United States, her skills were dismissed as superstition. She cleaned houses instead. My surprise must have shown on my face. I'm not telling you this to suggest I'll be lenient, she clarified. The law is still the law, but I want you to understand that I see the full dimensions of your case, and I want to propose an alternative to the current plea offer. What Judge Martinez outlined wasn't leniency exactly. It was creativity within the constraints of the law, a structured plea that would include guilty pleas to identity fraud and practicing without a license, a suspended sentence of 3 years, contingent on strict conditions, immediate deportation to Mexico, with a 5-year ban on re-entry, the establishment of a pathway program for individuals with international medical experience to gain accredited certification in the U.S., which I would help design from Mexico. You broke the law, Ms. Mendoza, she said as she prepared to leave, but you've also exposed failures in our systems that need addressing. This resolution punishes the former while acknowledging the latter. She stood. Consider it carefully. The offer will be formally presented tomorrow. As she reached the door, she turned back. My mother would have recognized in you a fellow healer. That doesn't excuse your choices, but perhaps it helps explain them. The next day, in a packed courtroom, I accepted the modified plea agreement. The judge's pronouncement was met with mixed reactions, shouts of both approval and anger from the gallery. As I was led from the courtroom toward the beginning of my journey back to Mexico, Veronica Castillo caught my eye from the press section. She nodded once, a gesture I understood. My story wasn't over. It was merely entering a new chapter. In the year since my deportation, the Mendoza Pathway Program has begun accepting its first applicants, internationally trained healthcare workers, seeking legitimate certification to practice in rural American communities. I consult on the program remotely, using my unique perspective to help bridge the gap between rigid credentialing and practical healing knowledge. Back in San Pedro Itzacan, I've established the clinic I once dreamed of, funded in part by donations from former patients in Millridge and readers touched by my story. We provide basic care, train community health workers, and serve as a satellite facility for medical mission groups. The questions my case raised remain largely unanswered. Who deserves to heal? How do we balance safety with access? What matters more, where knowledge comes from or how it's applied? But perhaps the most important question is one I ask myself daily as I treat patients in the village where my journey began. Was it worth it? When I look into the eyes of a child breathing easily after an asthma treatment, or a mother safely delivering her baby, or an elder receiving dignified end-of-life care, I know the answer. Healing was always my calling. The path I took to answer it was flawed, complicated, and ultimately costly, but I would choose it again. If Elena's story touched something in you today, you're not alone in wrestling with these complex questions. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories that challenge easy answers. Share this video with someone who might be interested in the complexities of healthcare access, immigration, or what it truly means to be a healer. Comment below. Where do you stand on Elena's case? Was she a criminal who endangered patients or a healer caught in a broken system? Should laws be enforced regardless of outcomes? Or should we consider the greater good? For those interested in learning more about the rural healthcare crisis or supporting the Mendoza Pathway Program, we've added resources in the description. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that don't fit neatly into right and wrong. Those are the stories we're committed to telling. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.